It's all part of the fun.
Okay, so again, tonight we're with Francis French, the author of two very wonderful books on the early days of man's space exploration from both the U.S. and the Russian side. So, Francis, it's all yours once again.
Okay, let's give this a try. Please give me a thumbs up, Andy, if you can still hear me. Hooray! Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the books. We wrote two books. Colin Burgess, who is a very accomplished Australian author who'd written many, many space books before, invited me to join his project, and we ended up writing one very, very long book, which was as long as Andy Chaikin's book, which I'm a big fan of. And at the end of that process, the publisher came back and said, "This is too long a book. We need you to chop it into two books," which is what we did. So we ended up, having never written a book before, I ended up writing two books in one go. So that was kind of fun. But Colin and I really wanted to tell some of the early stories in space because Andy Chaikin is an extremely hard act to follow, not only on this webcast, but also in terms of writing a book. What has Andy not talked about? Well, Andy's written about going to the moon and the people who journeyed there and some really personal stories. But what we felt was that there was a whole other side of stories that needed to be told. What were the Russians doing? In most American books, the Russians are this mysterious other who we're combating and fighting against, and you never really learn who they are. Now, Colin being from Australia, and as you can tell, I'm from England, we thought it was time to really just tell the stories of these people as people, because they were in the military in the Soviet Union, people were in the military in this country, they served their country, and you can't always choose what country or what system you grow up in. They were all patriots in their own way. So we decided, let's just tell the stories as they are. A lot of people had written about the Russians before in as kind of a detective story. Like Jim Oberg did some amazing work talking about the Russians, saying, this is how I found this archive, and this is how I found this picture, and this person had been airbrushed out. Did some amazing detective work, but we thought, it's time to stop telling these stories as detective work, and it's time to just tell it straightforwardly. There's a very short window of time after the Soviet Union collapsed, and which is kind of closed again now as these archives begin to close and they realize how much valuable information they've got. They don't give it away for free anymore. There was a very short window of time in which we could really get into learning what the Russians did and how they did their program. So, through a combination of talking to the Russians, finding some old archive material, talking to Americans and finding archive material there, we tried to piece together a story very chronologically of who flew in space and who they were. And that was a lot of fun to do with the Russians. We spoke to a lot of the cosmonauts, we learned a lot of their personal stories. But there were a whole lot of American astronauts who also had never told their personal stories in this kind of way. They'd been asked the usual, same old questions. How did it feel to walk on the moon? How do you go to the bathroom in space? Etc., etc. And you can see their eyes glazing over sometimes when they get asked the same old question. But what we try to do, and Colin's an amazingly good researcher to work with, we try and go behind those stories and try and find some real human stories that hadn't been told. And that's when you saw their attention perk up a little bit more and you saw them go, oh, nobody's asked me that before. And that's when those 40-year-old memories would suddenly start cranking into life. And we'd really hear some amazing stories that we've been told have never been told before. There were stories, for example, that Wally Schirra told us who said, I've told this to many people, but I've never told this on the record. And a couple of years later, before the second book came out, he passed away. And so, as far as we know, we have the only recorded examples of some of these stories, which were insider stories until then. So, really, a lot of fun to write this stuff. And to get to know some of these people, I grew up following the space program and living in England. The opportunities to meet and interact with astronauts were very, very rare. So to be able to come over here where people like Wally Schirra he was 15 minutes away from my house. He was essentially a neighbor. Working here at the Air and Space Museum, people would be by every week, every month. We have astronauts on the board. Suddenly it became a different kind of opportunity for me, and a really great opportunity to get to meet these people, socialize with them, have lunch with them, and a way in, because once you talk to one person, it's a very interesting little clique in which one person you'll speak to and they will tell you, you're asking intelligent questions, you're okay. And so the next person you want to go and speak to who doesn't do many interviews, you'll get a little bit of a reference. Okay, you're not really sure how they know about you, but all of a sudden they'll say, oh, Francis and Colin, I've heard about you guys. You're okay. I'll tell you some of this stuff. So I think with that became a lot of responsibility. with that came a lot of keeping confidences, and there are some stories we will never tell anybody because of that. But I think the process of being taken into a fold in some ways was a very, very rewarding one for us and a very good honor for us. Of course, we don't take that too far. We know that we are always on the outside looking in, but it was an amazing pleasure to be on the outside looking in. So it's a lot of fun. And here at the San Diego Air and Space Museum, which is my daytime job, of course, as I say, we get to work a lot with the astronauts and cosmonauts, and it becomes part of my job. So when I'm working on the space program stuff and interpreting that during the day, just as you guys do where you are, which is an absolutely amazing job. I've really enjoyed the things you have online. I use a lot in my own research. Amazing, great work, and please keep that up. Doing that sort of stuff during the day and then going home and writing about it, it all kinds of blends into each other after a while. So a lot of fun, and hopefully that's not too long and rambling a introduction for you.
No, no, no. That was very good. If anybody would like to ask a question right now, we can open up the mic tree to do that. Everybody has microphone privileges, so feel free to ask a question if you want, or like I said, you can. There we go. There's one right there. Someone asked a question. Without naming names, did you encounter any resistance or hesitation to discuss anything from any of the people you interviewed for your books?
Okay, had a little bit of microphone thing there. You can hear me okay again? Um, we did have some reluctance and hesitation from other people to keep other people's confidences, which I thought was actually quite touching. There were astronauts who would say, I'm surprised you're telling that story, and I'm surprised they agreed to tell you that story. So, in many ways, it was touching that after 35 years, somebody would say, well, I'm surprised they want to tell that. For example, we talked about Don Isley of Apollo 7, somebody who most people can't even pronounce his name, never mind know who he is, but he was the command module pilot of the very first Apollo command module, an incredibly important mission, yet got completely overlooked. The next mission goes, Apollo 8 goes to the moon, everybody forgets about Apollo 7, everybody forgets about Don Isley. My question was always, who is Don Isley? And it was a fascinating story of following a guy who was a very, very easygoing, mellow guy who just kind of drifted through the space program. And we sat around with a couple of astronauts who sometimes were scratching their heads to come up with stories about him. And yet he was in the middle of this enormous divorce scandal at the time because NASA's astronauts were not allowed to be divorced. And they were essentially, you would lose your flight. A lot of guys were watching what would happen when the first astronaut divorced. Would they lose their flight? Would they not? Don was kind of a test case, the last guy you would expect to be in the middle of a test case. Now, we spoke to both Wally and Walt, who flew with Don, and they told us a lot. We actually got both of Don's widows to not only talk to us, but to agree on a final chapter version, which everybody told us they are never going to agree on the same story. That won't happen. But we did. And so I think because we did it with confidence and we did it with respect and we did it carefully, we did get that kind of buy-in. However, when you talk about resistance and hesitation, we did get people, some of the other astronauts who were saying, I'm surprised. I don't really want to talk about that. I don't want to talk about them. And that was okay. I thought that was very interesting. The people involved had no problem talking about it. But the people watching from the outside, like I say, it's quite a self-protecting clique in a very good way. And they were still very hesitant, even 40 years later, even when everybody wanted the story to be told, to say, I don't want to add my part to that overall story.
Very interesting. Yeah, I've never heard that one. Uh, we also got a question submitted about a week or so ago from Apollo 15 command module pilot Al Warden, who asked, Francis, you have described who the Russians and Americans have selected in the past for spaceflight. There are huge differences in the selection qualities each country looked for. Would you comment on why the differences and what effect they had on the spaceflight activities for each country?
That's a great question. And What a putting me on the spot. One of the Apollo astronauts asking a question about astronaut selection, and of course, with Al Warden being a test pilot, of course, I'd have to say, well, America naturally chose test pilots because they were the absolute best people, and they shouldn't have chosen anybody else. And the Russians were silly not to do that. The question is a good one. The Al is a test pilot, came from a test piloting background, and was something that was very much the standard astronaut that NASA would choose at the time. He was the kind of guy who they really needed at the beginning of the program, and continually after that, they really needed people who knew how to fly those spacecraft, but then knew more than that. They needed to know how to do everything if something went wrong. And that was the key at the beginning of the program. Nobody knew what was going to happen from a physical point of view, from a psychological point of view, but particularly from an operational point of view. Who knew what was going to happen with those spacecraft? And to have a test pilot is about the nearest occupation to an occupation astronaut which did not exist before the space program. You want somebody that can get into a very, very difficult situation and work their way out of it. Now, America had the kind of spacecraft with Mercury and all the way through the program that were deliberately designed that people had to fly it. You couldn't fly the spacecraft from the ground. The people in mission control could offer input, they could offer advice, they could read up numbers, they were a vital part of it, but they could not fly the spacecraft from the ground. So to take Al's question and answer that, what were the differences with the Russians? The Russians were, it was far more, just as their society is, it was far more controlled centrally and a little less individual, and it reflected in their space program. What they had was, in many ways, a far more complicated spacecraft, in not only did it have to be flown in space by the person, it also could be operated from the ground. And they prefer to generally operate it from the ground. For example, Yuri Gagarin, the very first person in space, he never touched the controls of his spacecraft. Now, there are pros and cons to that. You could say it's very important for somebody to be able to fly their own spacecraft, or you could say what an amazing engineering achievement to put a person into space and they don't even have to touch anything. It's that advanced. There are different ways you could see that. So that was definitely the beginning of the space program. Was the Russians were jet pilots on the whole, not all of them, and there was really only one person at the very beginning you could consider a test pilot, and even then he didn't fit the exact definition of a test pilot. Where in the American program, it was very important, they felt, to choose people who were exclusively test pilots. And all the way through the program, that was the case, because once the first group of astronauts were test pilots, there was a little resistance to anybody else kind of coming in and spoiling their game. And that really didn't change until the shuttle, where it was very clear they needed very, very diverse groups of people. You needed doctors, you needed engineers, you needed scientists of different kinds. But Al is more of the classic mold of the Apollo astronaut, the Gemini, the Mercury astronaut, somebody who delighted in flying around the moon on his own. A lot of people ask those guys who flew around on the moon, weren't you lonely, weren't you scared, weren't you feeling strange being 250,000 miles from home? And those guys say, no, we were single-seat jet pilots. We loved being on our own. In fact, the best time was being alone around the back of the moon when we couldn't hear anybody else. We actually got some peace and quiet for once in the mission. We loved it. So very different kind of way of thinking, very different philosophy from the general public, I imagine.
Thank you. You got a question from Steve. With all of the Apollo flights, some of which you covered in the book, why did you spend the bulk of the time covering only two spacecraft, primarily Apollo 7 and 9?
Good question. The books are now part of a series. We started writing them as a single book, then it became two books, and they liked them so much it's now become a book series called Outward Odyssey. The next book is, I believe, set to come out later this year. I'm not one of the writers on it, but Colin, my co-author, is the series editor for it, and also the editor for that book. And that will follow on from the rest of Apollo 11 all the way through to, I believe, ASTP, the final Apollo mission, Apollo-Soyuz. So I think what we needed to do, and going back to Andy Chaikin again, was what did Andy not write about? Andy was very careful to focus on the missions to the moon. I was curious as to what some of those other stories were about. You don't hear much about Apollo 7. You really don't hear much about Apollo 9. Apollo 9 is somewhat dear to us because it's right here in this museum. The command module has made its home here. When you talk to the astronauts, they say that was the mission everybody wanted. More than Apollo 8. That was the mission, that was the test pilot mission. You would fly the command module with the lunar module for the first time. You'd undock them, you'd redock them, you'd blow off the bottom stage of the lunar module, you'd test the Apollo spacesuit, you'd test it all with the Saturn V. It was the first time all of the hardware that was going to go to the moon would be tested. And that was a big deal for test pilots. They really wanted that mission. And some of them can be a little bit disparaging about Apollo 8. They say, well, those guys, they went to the moon, they turned the radio on, it worked. Okay, we can come home. I think that's a little bit of an unfair way of looking at Apollo 8, because Apollo 8 had its own amazing achievements the first time anybody went out to the moon. But nevertheless, looking at Apollo 7 and Apollo 9, we really thought these are the stories that haven't been told. These are the ones that people are going to want to know about. And there are also astronauts we know are never going to write books. We know these are guys who, they're still 25 years old in their own minds. They're going to live forever. They're still out having fun. They don't have time to stop and write a book. But sometimes the people who don't stop to write a book are the most interesting characters. So going back to who was Don Isley, and then for Apollo 9, who is Rusty Schweickart? Who is Jim McDivitt? What is Jim McDivitt like? These astronauts are never going to write books. They're never going to take that time. And we really felt that their missions were a little bit underrated. So what we tried to do in the books throughout is to really pump up those missions that generally don't get talked about. We did talk about Apollo 10. We did talk about Apollo 11. But then again, there's so much focus on Apollo 11 all the time. We didn't need another book that focused on 11. What we tried to do was write a book that showed how Apollo 10 did everything but those last few tens of thousands of feet, and how important Apollo 10 was. There's another mission that gets really overlooked. And then really only talk about 11 in terms of what they did that nobody else had done, which is those last few miles. But as we explain in the book, boy, what a last few couple of miles those were, with those program alarms going off, with all the problems they had. So there was enough to talk about just with those last few minutes of the landing of Apollo 11 that we didn't really need to talk about the rest of that mission, which Apollo 10 had already tried out. So we really felt it was important to balance those stories. We know this is not the only space book people are going to read. We really hope it's not the only space book people are going to read. And so what we're hoping to do is try and round out the experience. Even more so we did with Gemini. The Gemini program is one that gets completely overlooked. People know about the Mercury program from the Right Stuff movie and other places. It's part of popular culture. People know about the Apollo moon landings as part of popular culture. The Gemini program, in many ways, that is where some of the most important stories are, some of the most fun stories, and yet it really gets overlooked. So the first half of our second book is almost exclusively the Gemini program, and we found some really good stories. And again, some really good astronaut stories in there where the guys would look at us and go, nobody ever asked me about Gemini. Thank you. Let me tell you a story. And we really got into that.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that. Michael had another question here. Being from England, what is the general view of the American space program in England, both past and present?
Well, I've been out of England since, let's see, 1997, so I definitely can't talk about what England is like now without somebody over there correcting me. I can talk about growing up in England, watching the space program, and I think it's particularly something I've been thinking about the last few days when they've been talking about what is going to be the final space shuttle mission. And somebody reminded me online that I had sent them an audio cassette of watching the very first space shuttle mission as a 10-year-old boy in my front room with trying to shout to my mother in the other room to come in and watch this moment, and she's finishing up doing something in the kitchen and doesn't want to come and see it with me. So my very first shuttle mission is a very, very young boy, and now I'm going to be virtually middle-aged by the time the last one goes. So it's been fascinating to see the changes and where I am at the beginning and the end of the missions. But growing up in England, I think you have a little bit of a different sense. Maybe that's why Colin and I could write a book that was far more Russian and American balanced. They're both foreign space programs. During the Cold War, we were far more allied with the Americans. During the Cold War, also our language was always has been allied with the Americans. So we probably felt far more of a familiarity and friendliness with the American space program. However, it was something that somewhere else did. It wasn't something that you see around at home all the time. And I think it becomes extra special because of that, because you don't see astronauts all the time. Where a member of this museum, you can see many astronauts every year. In England, not so many. I was lucky enough over time to meet all 12 of the people who walked on the moon. I'd only met three of those when I'd lived in England, and that was through going somewhere to a book signing, something special that brought people over. When I came over here, within a very short amount of time, just by driving to Los Angeles an hour up the road, I'd managed to meet all of the others. So, just that kind of difference of how sometimes having something that's a little harder to get makes it more special. And I think watching the American space program that way was made it extra special, and we were extra supportive of another country doing that and wished our own country could do that. I certainly remember hoping that England would do that, and were very proud when we finally put a Briton, Helen Sharman, in space on the Mir space station. That was a big day when we finally got to see a Briton in space, albeit piggybacking on somebody else's program. So that was kind of how I grew up. It was a very supportive thing, I believe. And as to what's happened in the last couple of decade and a half since I left, I really can't answer that because I'm not sure. My guess is that people are still very, very supportive of the American space program, still excited about their role as part of the International Space Station. You can see an English flag along with all the other flags of the countries represented on ISS, and I believe that people are very supportive of that. But I certainly hope that's the case, but my answer may be off base.
Thank you. Here's another question that came in earlier. Asked, how did you first get interested in spaceflight? How old were you? And what were your influences in this field?
That's a good question. I have no idea how young I was because I don't remember not being interested in space. I've always been interested in a lot of things, and growing up, I was fascinated by James Bond movies and space flight and lots of stuff which a lot of kids enjoy. And somewhere along the line, I guess this just kind of separated out, other things fall away, and I always stayed interested in this. I've never been that good at academic science, and yet I've ended up teaching a lot of people about science. I think in terms of my influences and where I went, I graduated towards museums as a career. I got qualified as a school teacher in England with a specialism in teaching science to elementary ages because I could grasp that much. When you got into high school, I started getting a little bit lost on the physics. But for elementary kids, I knew how to get those hooks where you get kids interested in science, interested in engineering and math and technology by finding everyday life, real examples, and bringing it into their realm of experience. So many people are scared of science as this kind of other. It's a little bit like walking into a modern art museum. A lot of people won't do it because they say, if I don't understand all of this, I can't understand any of it, so I'd rather not even try. And I find that a lot throughout my career in working with people in science is they're scared of it and they don't know where to begin. So if you can give them a real life example with kids, look around your kitchen, all the different science that happens in making food. And spaceflight is kind of like dinosaurs with kids. Every kid loves spaceflight and dinosaurs, and there's a great hook into getting excited about space and getting excited about science and engineering and on from there. So after getting qualified as a school teacher, I really got interested in working in science museums, and I did that in England, and I continue to do that in America because I think I'm not necessarily, I could never have been cut out to be a good scientist, but I do know how to inspire people to get excited about science. And often that's a different skill. We've all met the engineer who's done some amazing engineering and does not know how to say it. You put them in front of an audience and they are as dull as you can imagine. And yet you know they've got great stories and they've done amazing things. So my job, I think, is to try and interpret that so that the general public can get interested and excited about that. And it's an ongoing educational process for me. I'm learning as I go. I'm learning a lot of science, and in the meantime, I get to talk to a lot of amazing world-class scientists and have a great education myself. So I get paid to do what I enjoy, and you can't ask for more than that.
Well, I would certainly agree with you on that, Francis, because that's where, after all, that's what we do here at LPI in our education program. It's all about inspiring and trying to get folks interested in getting them hooked, as well as helping to get kids excited and even maybe do a little bit of training with them as well. Uh, Bernasconi, which I believe is Brent, just turned a question in there. With the space shuttle program in the United States on its way out and man landing on the moon years before children today were born, what do you think should be done to excite the youth of today about space exploration?
Well, that's a question that a lot of people are asking right now. A lot of people are talking about They were getting inspired and excited to go back to the moon, and a lot of these science centers around the country are scrambling right now, particularly the ones that are just built very constellation-centric exhibitions. What do? And how do they get kids excited? The great thing about spaceflight and astronomy in general is there's so much you can choose from that having one minor element of a very, very, very big puzzle disappear may not be such a big deal. I think it's always great to get kids excited in different ways. You can talk about the past. The good thing about the past with Apollo is that a lot of those guys are still around, and kids can still meet somebody who flew around the moon or flew to the moon and landed on it. But then there's so much that's happened since, and I'm a big proponent of getting people excited about the International Space Station and about the space shuttle because it is something that is inherently more difficult to sell to the general public. It's more of a challenge. That makes it more interesting. For example, I was down at the Kennedy Space Center not that long ago, and I was standing in the room where they have all the different modules that are being launched to ISS, including the one that's just gone up, and got a real good opportunity to see that up close. Standing in that clean room, and on the floor there was a sticker, and it said, "From this sticker until the other end of the room, that's how long the International Space Station is right now." And I'm staring down this amazingly long room that's longer than a football field, and trying to imagine an object, a human-made object that's been bolted together over time up in space. And I found that in many ways way more exciting than people on the moon. And it's how you get that across to the general public can be as simple as putting a sticker a certain distance away from somewhere. It's little things that people understand, I think, like that. And so I think we can excite people about what's going on right now. I think we can excite people about what's happened in the past. There's almost two different threads. One is the exploration thread. There's always a feeling that we should be pushing out ever onwards. And then there's also a feeling that we should be doing some very, very, not so exciting perhaps, but some very careful studies of how we homestead space, how we live there, how we work there. And that is a fascinating thing in itself. Most people, I think, would trade a lot to spend 5 minutes in space wherever they were, whether it was on the space station or whether it was on the moon. So finding those hooks and getting people excited about it is the key. But NASA has a really good group of astronauts right now that if you can get them out on the road, we'll do that. We had, for example, Tracy Caldwell down here not too long ago. She's over in Star City now training to go up to ISS, but she's about my age, which is great when you finally see astronauts your own age showing up, and is about as exciting a speaker as you can imagine. And exactly the kind of person that NASA should be putting out there and does to get people excited about space exploration.
All right, thank you. Michael C. has another question. What sort of facilities or special arrangements had to be made at the San Diego Air and Space Museum for the display of the Apollo 9 command module?
Well, Apollo 9 came to the museum before I worked here, and so I can be more honest than just to say the company line, in that before I worked here, I thought it was the best displayed command module anywhere in the world. You go to many command modules around the country and they're covered in that plexiglass. You can't see them. They kind of look like a Hershey's Kiss all wrapped up. You don't really get a sense of a spacecraft. And Apollo 9 here, it has internal lighting. It feels like it's a living object. It doesn't feel like a dead hulk of metal. The way they did that was to work with the Smithsonian very, very carefully. You're not allowed to put much heat or much power or much light inside a historic object like a command module, but you could put helicopter LED lights in there, which have very little power, no heat at all, but a lot of light. So you walk up to Apollo 9, you look through the hatch, and you see lights on in there. It looks like it's about to fly. And a great feeling. The way it came here is it was coming from Michigan. It was at a science center in Michigan, which was the commander's home state, which closed. And over time, a lot of these command modules have been coming back from around the world. There were command modules in Canada, there were command modules in Paris. There's still one in England, which I really hope they keep there, because that was the only spacecraft I ever saw for many, many years in my life. But they're gradually coming back to America. They were sent out as ambassadors, I think, of international diplomacy, and now, as time goes on, they're having a different role of explaining the past here in America. And this center closed down in Michigan. At the same time, Apollo 7 was on the road and being moved to Dallas. So they did a 2-for-1 combined operation in which they trucked Apollo 7 to Dallas. They hand-built a special container for it to travel, which they then turned around and picked up Apollo 9 in, and trucked it across the country. I heard a lot of fun stories from the truck drivers. I was actually here on the day it arrived, even though I didn't work here. I heard which day it was coming in and showed up at the back door when Apollo 9 arrived. And the truck drivers had so many great stories about driving down the road and saying, I've got a spacecraft following me, and all kinds of crazy UFO stories came out of that. They got out of a lot of traffic tickets by telling the cops what they had, and the cop would say, well, if you allow me to peek through the little side hatch, then I'll let you get off without a ticket. They they had fun just traveling across. It then arrived and it's a whole special mount has been made for it. The sad thing about Apollo 9 is there are indentations in its heat shield because it was somewhat improperly displayed before. It was put on a big metal container which held it up, and yet over time gradually depressed lines into the heat shield. So the amazing curatorial staff here have been really, really good at making sure that no further damage happens to it, and in fact it's very, very well preserved and protected. And the Smithsonian follow it with watching the couches in there to see how long it takes for the different material that's on the couches to perhaps deteriorate or how long it leaves. They're watching it as a test case for how to preserve and protect these command modules, because it really is amazing to think we've got something in here that we have the huge photo, which is a very iconic, famous photo of Dave Scott leaning out of the hatch of Apollo 9, and a picture taken from the lunar module. And you can look at that picture, and then you can look at that actual hatch and think that's the same hatch that was up there in space with that guy hanging out of it. And that's just one of those inherently cool moments, I think. So we really enjoy doing that. On the same subject, we've had all of the Apollo 9 crew come back and see the spacecraft over time. In fact, they all came back in one go within the year. The first time they'd all been in a room together for about 15 years, and they think it's the first time they were all together with a spacecraft since the flight. And you'd think these guys would get nostalgic about the spacecraft, but they really don't. It's funny, Rusty Schweickart looked at his spacecraft and he said, when I look at the spacecraft, I don't think about the short amount of time I was in space in it. I think about the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours I sat in Downey, turning off switches, turning on switches, making sure it worked before we went. So they think about it in very, very different ways than the public might think they think about it.
Yeah, you talk about displaying command modules. The Apollo 13 capsule or command module is at the Kansas Cosmosphere and Space Center in the middle of Kansas and Hutchinson. And it's interesting because when you go there, it's behind plexi, like you mentioned, but it's also kind of dark where it's at. So it's really kind of hard to get a look at it. You can get a good look at the heat shield on the outside, but it is really difficult to see on the inside. So I like hearing that Apollo 9 is in a way that you could really get a good look at it. Another question from Steve. Considering that time in American history, could you please comment on the contributions made by African Americans to putting man on the moon?
Well, the time of NASA putting humans on the moon was also a time of great civil change in this country. And now I am not an expert on the huge civil changes that happened in this country, so I may not be the best person to speak on this subject. But over time, it's been very interesting to look at some of the efforts at the time that NASA made to bring in underrepresented groups into their program. And when I talk about underrepresented groups, I'm talking about women as well as African Americans, or many, many different kinds of groups. The trouble NASA had is that they went out looking for the best qualified people, and they, in an engineering world that was kind of a bubble of outside of the social changes that were happening in the 60s. I talked to a lot of those engineers, and they say, I wasn't aware of the big social changes that were happening at that time. I had no idea. There's a famous quote from Frank Borman, who in 1969 didn't know who James Dean was, who had been such a big icon in the 50s and had already passed away at that point. He had no idea who he was because he'd spent all this time in flight school, in West Point, in engineering institutions, and in NASA. So they were kind of isolated from the outside world. However, NASA needed tax dollars. NASA needed to keep the politicians happy, and when you're doing that, you do need to be part of the social fabric of the country. NASA did make a lot of concerted efforts to bring women engineers into the program. They made very visible efforts to bring African American engineers into the program. You look at some of their advertisements at the time, they were actively recruiting in certain towns and using faces of people who you don't typically think of as the stereotypical engineer on their advertising. Because when we think of the stereotypical flight controller, we probably think of a white guy with a buzz cut, with a white shirt, with a pocket protector, the kind of the Gene Kranz kind of look. It's a very stereotypical look. You look at some of the NASA advertising at the time; they went in a completely different direction, which is and ahead of a lot of the other organizations at the time. You look at where NASA was compared to some other administrations, they were actually actively recruiting far ahead of the time. And that meant that you did get a number of minority groups in the program a lot earlier than you saw in other very prominent programs. For example, I was talking about Norm Casson, who was, I believe, has joined us, who was one of the very few people you saw who was a black guy in a very, very upper management position at that time. He could go to the head of Downey, he could North American Aviation, who were building the command module, and say, "I need this. This is going to be a multi-million-dollar change," and it would happen. That's what Norm tells me. He could make those things happen. Maybe go an hour up the street into a certain part of LA and he couldn't get served at a lunch counter. So a very, very different dynamic of what was happening, I think. You also look at where the Kennedy and Johnson administration placed a lot of the NASA facilities. You see a lot of them in the South. You see a lot of them in places that had not really had those opportunities to have high engineering, and it did include a lot more minority intake that hadn't happened at the time. So NASA couldn't solve problems that were social problems at the time, but I think compared to a lot of other administrations, they really did go out of their way to try and do some advances, and that's why we see some amazing people in that program at the time, like Norm. Later, as we get into the 70s, and they really made some far more active efforts to recruit people into their most prominent positions, which are astronauts. And at that point, you see people like Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek. You see her doing public television ads saying, "We need astronauts." And so when there's a lot of women, particularly a lot of black women, saw Nichelle Nichols on TV, they're like, "Okay, astronauts look like me." And that's a whole other dynamic. That's something we deal with a lot in San Diego. I still work with a lot of kids. You sit them down, you ask them to draw an image of a scientist. And we think we're beyond all this stuff right now in 2010. You ask them to draw a scientist, they will draw an Einstein-looking guy wearing a white lab coat, holding a test tube, working in a basement on their own. Now, if you ask a 7-year-old girl, is that going to be you when you grow up? No, it's not. So to get beyond those stereotypes of what scientists look like and to get into that they can be a scientist is very important. So I congratulate NASA on those efforts, but we still have a long way to go in the general public, and that's what we're trying to do here right now with kids, is to make kids realize that everybody can be a scientist. In fact, when they come in here on a weekend program and they do an experiment with us, they are a scientist because they just did an experiment.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you. And actually, speaking of Norm, yes, he is still with us. I see it. He actually submitted a question to us earlier. Norm, I know you. I think you had a mic earlier. If you'd like to jump on, ask your question yourself, you're more than welcome to, or I can do that for you. Up to you.
Okay, am I being heard? Good. In the epilogue of your book, Francis, In the Shadow of the Moon, you likened the plant at Downey, California to the Tower of Babel that was built by Nimrod to expose himself and his people to the mysteries of the universe. You go on to speculate a comparison of the archaeological site of the tower to the soon-to-be archaeological site of the Downey plant, now crumbling and set for demolition. My question to you, Francis, is there no hope to preserve at least some part of that plant for the posterity of future generations? After all, probably more people throughout the entire world bore witness to that landing of Apollo 11 than all of the people that ever visited all of the national parks of this great country. All of those parks have been preserved and nationalized. Can't we do this for just one of those buildings at Downey, California? Is anyone working on this?
Well, that's a great question, Norman. Let me start by saying thank you for what you did for the space program, because you did an amazing job. Can you guys still hear me? I can't hear myself now. Okay. Thank you, Norm, for doing an amazing job on checking out those spacecraft, because without you and the hundreds of thousands of people around the country like you, we would not have got to the moon. So thank you, Norm, from, I'm sure, everybody here. I'm not an expert on the subject you're talking about. I've worked with people who are. When you're talking about Downey in particular, my understanding is the city of Downey are making far more of an effort to preserve the space history there. Because when we think of Downey as a suburb of the LA, Orange County area, they were the people that built the spacecraft that went to the moon. They built the X-15. They built parts of the space shuttle. It's a place where some of the most amazing stuff happened in history. And yet once that plant closed, about 10 to 15 years ago for good, there was nothing in Downey to make you realize that this is where some of that incredible stuff had happened. Over the last few years, the City of Downey have really made a concerted effort, as I understand it, to start doing something about that. There is a Columbia Space Science Center right next to the Downey plant, which is they're gradually bringing back the Apollo boilerplate spacecraft. They're teaching kids. They have a Challenger Center there where kids can go through simulated space missions. They're beginning to learn how to honor and work on that history. The rest of the plant, part of it's been turned into a huge movie studio. If you've ever seen movies like Iron Man and some of the huge shots in that movie where they need a huge amount of space, but they need to enclose and control it, the room that was the biggest clean room in the world turns out to be an ideal room to turn over to a movie studio. So they've been making a lot of big movies there. There's parts of Terminator movies, there's part of Dracula movies. Every now and then you go past there and there are some buildings painted in really odd colors and shapes, or you'll go there and there's a new hole dug into the ground of one of the buildings where there's a swimming pool where Spielberg's been making some water movie. So having gone from doing some of the most amazing science fact, it's now moving into some of the most amazing science fiction that you may ever see on the screen. And so an interesting place. So they're using buildings for different purposes. The trouble with preserving and protecting everything, I think, is where to start and where to end. I think we saw that at the Kennedy Space Center not that long ago when there was a big effort to try and preserve the tower that Apollo 11 and many other Saturn V's had launched from, which had been sitting in a field for a long, long time, essentially rusting away. There was an effort to try and preserve it at least until a time where it could be restored and put back up again. And it turned out for many different reasons, part of them money, part of them chemical leakage into a wildlife area, they eventually scrapped all that metal. I would have loved to have seen it go back up, but at the same time I can understand why, given a choice between putting money into a new program or putting all your money into preserving the old, sometimes the new stuff takes precedence. And that's where museums like us, I think, have to really take an even wider role and try and preserve what we can. And my understanding, as I say, I'm not an expert on this, my understanding is the City of Downey have taken great steps in the last few years to begin to do that. There's a great group in Downey, which is also there, the ALF, the Legacy Foundation there, I believe, and they've consolidated all the stuff they can find on the Downey site into one building, which the city has allowed them to have, and they have so much documentation and paperwork and important objects that were left on site, and they're doing their best to preserve and protect those. And the beginning of your statement there, the comparison to the Tower of Babel, you've obviously read the book very closely, and I thank you for that. The comparison came about there because Colin, my co-author, he tends to be more the flowery, poetic kind of guy, and he'll do analogies between the Tower of Babel and that disappearing and the end of the Apollo program. And I'm more the realist and the cynic, I think, or at least I that's what I'm told. And when I read this, I said, well, Colin, that's a little bit flowery. Then the next weekend, I went out to Downey and did some what they call urban archaeology. We went through some of those buildings. Some of the rooms were being pulled down on the other side of the building as we were working, going through old workshops, going through old offices, finding file cabinets full of North American aviation documents, getting them out of there into a safe place before these buildings were torn down. And even though it had only been between 5 to 10 years that some of these buildings had been abandoned, it felt like walking around parts of ancient Egypt. It felt like you were walking through a historical site that people had walked away from and let to crumble into ruin. So that's where I went back to Colin and I said, okay, we're going to keep your analogy, but we're going to make a modern day comparison of what Downey is like and how, in a very, very short amount of time, the place that was the absolute center of technological excellence went into an archaeological graveyard. However, that book was written 5 or 6 years ago, and now what I'm seeing at Downey is far more hopeful, and I really do hope they are going to continue in their efforts to preserve and protect, because, as you mentioned, it's a very, very important part of history, and we do need to preserve it, just as we need to preserve the national parks and all those other great places we have around this country.
Thank you, Francis. Another question here from Michael C. Does the San Diego Air and Space Museum anticipate getting any space shuttle artifacts when the shuttle retires at the end of the year?
We work with our curatorial department, of which I'm the education department, so I'm not the spear point on this one. What I understand from our curatorial department is we have submitted for a lot of different artifacts. It is not a lottery process, but you put in for a lot of things, and then you're not sure whether you're one of dozens of museums all asking for the same thing or not. My understanding from the last time I talked to our curator about this is that there are hundreds of objects out there. We should have a good chance of getting some good, impressive items because NASA has so much to dispose of, and a lot of it is really top class kind of thing people want to see in museums. So we're really hoping we're going to get some amazing stuff, but it is a long bureaucratic process. So we are hanging in there. We're putting in everything we can for it. But we do feel Southern California has a very important role to play. We are one of the biggest museums close to the Downey area, close to the Edwards area where the shuttles were launched and the shuttles were tested, and some of them still land out there. We have the Atlas rockets were made right here in San Diego. We have huge amount of space history in this town. So we are really hoping that we get many items that really reflect our role as one of the important towns in the whole history of the space program.
Another question that had been submitted earlier. First, though, I'll ask if anybody else out there have a question they'd like to have their mic. They can chime in. Let's see if we've got one getting ready to come up here on the box in a little bit. Okay, well, I'll ask this one that came to us earlier. As the author of two books about the history of space, how do you feel about the future of space travel and those that support what is called new space?
That's an interesting thing. It's somewhat easier to write about things that happened in the past because even though you can't necessarily get all the information and documentation, and sometimes memories begin to fade and people start to remember the story the way they'd like to remember it rather than the way it happened on occasion, at least it's kind of set. And the difficulty in talking about and writing about things that happen right now is, of course, as we're seeing right now, everything's changing every week. And how do you explain and interpret that to the general public? It's a difficult one. And I'm very intrigued to see what's happening right now. I've got opinions about it. This is probably not the best place to share them. But I'm very curious to see what happens next. I'm watching people who are saying this is the end of human spaceflight. I'm watching other people who are saying this is the beginning and the best thing that can possibly happen. My suspicion is anybody on either end is probably going to eventually come somewhere into the middle, like often these conversations do. And in 10 years' time, we'll all be saying, well, I was always in the middle of this conversation. And that's kind of the way these things go. But to watch is very fascinating as we see a real shake-up of what's going on right now. And it's very interesting to work in an aviation museum and see that because we go right back to the birth of aviation. And if we imagined 50 years after the very first Wright brothers flight that a government organization would be controlling every single airplane flight, people would think that was insane. Spaceflight is a very, very different business, as we're seeing. Here we are 50 years later, and the shuttle is still essentially the way Americans get into space. So different way of looking at it. Now people will try and make flight analogies with spaceflight analogies, but as we've seen with a number of accidents over the years, spaceflight is a far more unforgiving business with far higher tolerances, far more money needed. If something goes wrong, it goes catastrophically wrong very, very quickly. It's a very different business. So how much you can compare these things, I don't know. So I'm more interested than opinionated, I think, at this time. I just really want to see what happens next, and fortunately in a position where I hear interesting things from interesting people who know far more about this than I do, and if we have this conversation in a year's time, we'll probably have a completely different conversation about it, and that's what makes history interesting, and to be part of history as it's happening.
Yeah, there certainly is a lot of noise out there right now on this, and of course we're kind of loud down here in Houston. But I guess the best thing probably to do is just like we have to do, just wait and just see what ultimately comes out of this. Um, Steve here has another question. One of the things that impressed me most about the Aerospace Legacy Foundation and the Downey site was the red carpet still painted on the pavement and visible from satellite images. It is now a parking lot for semi-trailers. Could you tell us about that red carpet where they receive the astronauts home from space?
Well, it's a little bit like when you go to Karnak or places in ancient Egypt and you see these huge procession rows of old statues, and you imagine the pharaohs of old walking down these things, and there can be very elaborate paintings still with the color all there and everything's there, and then a war will end and there's nothing. You can be looking at a 20 to 30 foot high elaborate painting, and then a couple of inches to the left-hand side, it's completely gone, and there's no evidence that anything was there at all. It's hard to go to Downey and not get a sense of history. And one of the things you do when you're out there is you walk around a corner and there is a big red painted stripe, a little bit wider than your average automobile, that goes out to a helicopter pad. And for those of you who've looked at photos of space history over the time, I know the photos in at least the original copy of Walt Cunningham's The All-American Boys. It may be in the second editions too. There's a very famous picture which really gets a sense of how much the astronauts were revered as characters, as you see this helicopter sitting on the pad, these three lone figures walking down this red painted carpet, and there's almost nowhere else to stand around because the entire plant has come out to see them arrive. And you get a sense of, here's an entire company and maybe an entire nation looking at these three guys, and the entire program's on their shoulders, particularly as with that example, Walt Cunningham being on Apollo 7. That was the flight after Apollo 1 that was going to get America back into space and back to the moon before the end of the decade. You really look at that picture and you don't just get a sense of how much people were idolized, you also get a sense of the responsibility those guys must have felt. And also a very good thing that happened in those plants, which the astronauts did go and visit, not just to work, but also to meet all the guys out there, because there's a very great difference, I'm told, between an engineer working on something and thinking, I got half an hour left, I'll just screw the screw in and I'll let go, to standing there and going, I know the guy who's going to fly on this. If I don't do this right, that guy's life might be in danger. And I just met that guy last week. He came by, he shook my hand, he said, good job. It becomes a personal thing. So I think NASA were very careful and clever in sending the astronauts out to those plants. But you go out there now, and it's true. There is a faded, red, painted carpet out there. There's just an echo, in many ways, like ancient Egypt and some of those places, of an echo of greater times for that particular place.
Very interesting. Thank you. Another question here asking, we mentioned you're an award-winning author for your two books. So what were those awards that you were given?
There's been a couple of awards we've been up for. I know that the publisher talk about award winning. My assumption is they're talking about Choice Magazine, which is the only award I know the books did definitely win, as I believe they were voted as one of the best reads of the year. I'm not sure what category, to be honest. I also know we were finalists in a couple of other awards, which are the Emmy Award, the Eugene Emmy Award, which is the AAS, which is a very, very prestigious award. That was we were finalists for that, and I think quite rightly the Neufeld book about von Braun won that year, and I would have been amazed if that book hadn't won. So I was honored that our book was a finalist in that process. But of course, you don't write books for money. You don't write books for awards. They're very nice when they happen. But the thing that really means, I think, probably more than anything to us, and again, it's not why you write it, but it probably means more as an end process, is when people like Norm and people like the astronauts and their wives and their widows come and they kind of say, you got it right. And that really means a lot. I had an engineer talking to us the other week who, in typical engineering fashion, and I won't say his name in case he doesn't want this story to be associated with him, in typical engineering fashion, he had the copy of the book, and he had a pad on each side, and he had two different colors of highlighted ink, and he went through the book and he wrote notes on engineering things, and he wrote notes on things he wanted to look up, and he essentially stripped the book bare like an engineering diagram, and the things he wasn't sure about he went away and looked up, and after this laborious process, which only an engineer would do with a book, he came back and he said it was all right, and he was there, and that kind of thing, it means, it sounds like a cliche, but it really does make it, all those years of work, worthwhile for people to say thank you for writing that, because you told a story that needed to be told, and thank you, you got it right. And that's more important. I think that's our award winning right there. That's my award.
Great. Looks like we'll take one more, our last question from Michael for this evening. Do you have any other space flight related books planned? If so, could you give us any details?
Well, I'm working on another couple of projects personally. The Apollo era is one that really fascinates me, and there are still stories to be told, just as one of the the people asking a question earlier on said, why did we only concentrate on some of those early missions? There are so many stories to be told after Apollo 11 because that's when the program really kicked into high gear, and that's where the amazing amount of science, I think, happened. And we had people driving around on the moon. We had people doing incredible stuff. Going back to a question earlier on about how England saw that, the space program, that was something that I found in my research, which was somewhat interest dropped off in this country after Apollo 11. It didn't. If you look at the press in other countries, they in fact were more excited about 15 and 16 and 17. They were people are driving around the moon. They're living there for 3 days. This is amazing. This is what Apollo is all about. And yet it finished in this country. And those stories haven't always been told. I don't know if many people could tell you how Ken Mattingly felt about his flight, or Ron Evans felt about his flight, or guys who flew to the moon, and yet most people couldn't tell you how they felt about anything related to space. There are some amazing stories out there that have yet to be told. And so I'm working on one project that will hopefully do some work on that. I'm also working on a shuttle-related project personally. But in terms of these books, as I mentioned, they're part of a series, and later this year, the book called Footprints in the Dust is going to continue the story of the Apollo missions, and there are books planned after that for the shuttle program. There's also a prequel book that talks about the program before our books, and so it goes way back to people imagining time going into space. It talks about the early satellite programs. It talks about the early selection of astronauts and cosmonauts, and ends right as our book begins. And so there are lots of stories out there. And part of these questions sometimes I know get prompted because we ended our second book on quite a tease, which was deliberate, because most people, when they talk about Apollo 11, they talk about the first person to stand on the moon, the first footprint on the moon. And we deliberately stopped it with the landing. And we thought a lot of people would go, you can't stop there, you've got to keep going. But when we talked to Neil Armstrong and Buzz and people like that, I didn't interview Neil for this book, but I'd spoken to him other times in the past, and he's repeated this in many public presentations he's given, which I've seen. He would say, I'm a Navy pilot, I'm a naval aviator, I take great pride in landing an airplane. In fact, when I landed on an aircraft carrier, it's one of the most challenging things I ever did in my life, and I was very, very proud of it. Once I taxied the aircraft to a stop, and I opened the canopy and I walked down the ladder, that was no big deal. Anybody could do that. And I think he plays it up a little bit, but at the same time, that's how he sees walking down the ladder and standing on the moon. It was no big deal. Anybody could walk down a ladder. Landing on the moon was one of the most challenging flight and engineering operations he'd ever done in his life. So we kind of left it on a tease where we stopped at the landing, because that is how the guys who flew the mission felt about it. The landing was the moment. The walk was how people on Earth felt about it. So I'm not surprised that people want to know what happens next, and that's where I hope this next book is really going to pick the story up and continue with other voices.
Thank you. Real quick here, Suzanne has here as a side, where in the UK is the command module, and is it on
The
display?
command module on display in England is Apollo 10, which is at the Science Museum in South Kensington in London. And as a child, I used to make pilgrimages down from Manchester in North England. I used to go down there, and I would always make sure to go in the Science Museum. In fact, at a time when I couldn't afford to pay to go in the Science Museum, at a time there was a few years where it was paid to get in, I would wait until the hour at the end of the day when you could get in for free, and then I'd go in and have my reverential moment with the object. And so now to work somewhere where there's a command module I walk past twice a day on my way in and out the building is wonderful. So Apollo 10 is in a milestones of transportation gallery, and they have the Stephenson's rocket, one of the very first steam engines. They have all kinds of other very, very important vehicles from history, and Apollo 10 is sitting there. And Apollo 10 is still the object which, relative to the Earth, people have traveled fastest in. And so it still holds a particular record as a transportation object. And I know there have been efforts to try and bring it back to America, like all the other spacecraft have been coming back over the years, but I really do hope that one stays down at the Science Museum in London, because there are more tourists in London than almost anywhere else in the world, and it really is an ambassador for America's space program, and people can go and see this amazing thing and realize that people traveled in that object faster than any humans have ever traveled before and have ever traveled since.
Thank you. Um, And real quick, Francis, when is that your next book coming out? Later this year sometime, is that correct?
The Footprints on the Moon book, I believe, is coming out in the fall. As it's not one that I've worked on directly, I'm not entirely sure, but the University of Nebraska Press, who are the publishers for all the books, they have a website, and I would definitely encourage you people to look up there. I also know that it's already on Amazon for pre-order, so that should have a date for when that comes out too. What we generally find is that University of Nebraska Press will put a publishing date which is a safe date. That's when all the publishing houses should have it in stock and ready to go. However, it's normally shippable a couple of weeks before that. So you might want to look at that date and then actually subtract a couple of weeks off that for the chances of when you'll actually get it. But I believe it's later this year, and I'm looking forward to reading it too. I read it in proof form and made a couple of suggestions, but I haven't seen the final polished version yet as it comes out of the printers, and I'm looking forward to seeing it too.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you very much, Tony. I'm sorry, Tony. Francis, for joining us tonight. We certainly hope you may be able to come back sometime later and join us again for another one of these. We would certainly enjoy that. And thank you again, everybody, for your patience as we tried to work through our technical difficulties we had earlier. We really appreciate that and glad you stuck with us. Um, Want to remind everybody that when we close out this webcast tonight, you'll be automatically redirected, hopefully, to just a real quick, like 5 question survey. We'd like you to answer. If you don't have to, but if you take a few minutes to do that, um, that would be great. Just kind of help us plan our future webcasts a little more. And I just want to leave with one more very nice thing, comment on Francis's book. This actually comes from Norm as well. It came in his question that he sent us earlier. He says that he just recently read In the Shadow of the Moon, and he says he found himself living in the Apollo project all over again. I mean, your book had us down pat. It wasn't just about the preparation for the missions, it was about the people, the human element behind the preparation, the anguish, the thrills, the glory, and the despair, all told in such a manner that was logical, accurate, believable, and straightforward. So if you haven't been convinced yet to pick up those books, if you haven't read them yet, hopefully that does it. I also recommend reading Francis's book as well. So we'll have another webcast in 2 more weeks. So keep watching the My Moon site, and we'll get that up there information of who that will be next. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you in a few more weeks.